so much, Bruce, and the committee for the Wall of Honor. I'm here to share for folks that didn't know Paul a little bit about his life. And, I learned a little bit more about him tonight as far as East Greenwich High being the Avengers. And I think probably that had something impact on him as far as his spirit and temperament.
We got the name because we lost so much and we had to keep avenging the losses. Didn't know that, did you? See,
So, today on this sunny day, I can picture him smiling and joking around with his high school buddies. His high school friends meant a lot to him. He held on to his yearbook, right, all these years. I mean, he was, and he cherished the notes from his classmates, and his fellow chorus and drama and Latin club members. It's cliche to say that when a person dies, it's like a library burning to the ground. But in Paul's case, a better metaphor would be that the crowdsourced encyclopedia, Wikipedia, went offline. Even that metaphor really minimizes Paul's incredible scope of knowledge, especially around social movements, labor history, Irish history, labor, and much more. In the age of the internet, when people say you can find anything online, so many things Paul would tell us you couldn't find by Googling. Paul's memory was too immense for any of us to replace, but we can try together to keep our memories of him alive and carry on the struggles he fought for. Paul was an avid reader, consuming several newspapers daily until he became legally blind. I want to thank the staff at the Veterans Home who really provided excellent care for Paul throughout his last days. And they actually helped read the newspaper for him after he became blind, which was really extraordinary and made a big difference to his daily life. And so, as Bruce mentioned, he had this 2-column obituary in the journal that really only gave a glimpse of his almost 80 years. We know that his life really included volumes of struggle for a better world. He lived in this world as long as he could, and although his life ailments were heart failure, his heart never failed to care about others. Paul had many friends who he always bring cheer to. He belonged to so many organizations, including people of faith, and people who believed in people-powered social change, like the Mediator Fellowship and Pax Christi. Paul's life efforts in justice and community changed with the times, from his youth activism to being active on the board of Senior Agenda Coalition and the Grey Panthers. Paul was always willing to lend friends his ear, offering gentle support for those who were in distress. But he could be a danger to those who were corrupted by power, privilege, or position. Paul not only knew about the positive accomplishments of people's movements, he also knew the track records of betrayals going back generations. He had a genealogical knowledge of the elite's relatives and what political skeletons were in whose closets. And Paul wasn't afraid to say out loud what many would only think in private. Paul was a mentor to me. I met him through the struggle because he would show up at many actions and meetings. People talk about how some politicians would attend the opening of an envelope. Paul would show up for any action for justice, small or big. He would lend his voice to an issue, whether it was seen as controversial or not. He would speak up whether or not speaking out was convenient. He would say what was needed to be said, regardless of how the consequences could affect his own personal well-being, his career, or his comfort. Coming from a place of compassion and determination, Paul brought his critical insight to everything. He encouraged us to be our best. One of his favorite sayings was that we should not be uncritical lovers or unloving critics. It didn't matter who you were, Paul challenged us all to learn and grow. Even as Paul faced more and more physical limitations, he still reached out to work with others. For example, he joined the National Federation of the Blind, and at one of their conferences, he attended a session about the United Blind Industrial Workers of America. These were groups of disabled blind workers that were forming a union in the rural South. After Paul spoke during the meeting, they were so impressed by his knowledge and experience in the labor movement and with disability rights that they asked him to join their board to support blind workers organizing. He once said during a visit to Occupy Providence after he became blind that although he had lost his sight, he didn't lose his vision. No matter what Paul's physical condition was, he would still regularly call on his friends and tell us his take on current news events and to call out politicians, always sharing a strategic critique about what next should be done to fight for more justice. So many of us find easy excuses to not get involved and use disagreements with others as a way to legitimize not being more active. Paul could be disagreeable and with those in power who needed to be reminded about what they were doing wrong, but he also worked with people across a broad range of issues. When we think of Paul's life, we notice his eclectic range of friends and the diverse relationships he held together. Many of Paul's friends would be difficult to get in the same room together if it wasn't for him. He had the ability to talk to anybody at length on just about any subject. But just as importantly, he always listened to others to find points of unity. Paul sought common ground on issues rather than dismissing others on what he disagreed with them about. These are just a few of the pins that were Paul's, right? You have a pin for peace, and he was also very, very active in veterans' rights. He was the president of the Veterans Residence Council, right? Some people might think of these things as contradictory, but they weren't. So Paul had a reflective side also. He would think back on his own past behavior and think that the time to reach out to others he may have disagreed with. Although he challenged people, he also didn't put himself above others or think he was better than other people. Looking at Paul's life as a whole, his quiet times and the caring counsel that he offered to friends was as important as the times he led strikes, spoke out, or risked arrest to push for change. He knew relationships, sometimes fragile and difficult to maintain, are the medium, content, and glue to keep our movements together and strong and give us love to sustain us. It didn't matter how ill Paul was, he was always ready to share wit and humor. He would joke with or talk philosophy with doctors, saying that he was part of an employment plan to keep doctors employed. He would recite scripture or poems by heart, quote philosophers, or break down historical events with ease, even when he was struggling to breathe. Sometimes his obscure commentary would lead healthcare providers to question his wellness, and I would have to explain the intentional cleverness in his pun or remark. That was just Paul. In a moment when we are facing the highest unemployment since the Great Depression and increased awareness about inequality and racial justice, let's recall how Paul fought for more relief for the unemployed and food security in Rhode Island. We can think about the thousands of people Paul assisted to gain unemployment or food assistance. Paul spent almost 30 years working with those for assistance because they were unemployed or hungry. Issues of economic justice and war were not abstract to Paul. He grappled with them when he was drafted into the army and in the ways he dedicated himself to working directly with others and the poor. He advocated for better working conditions and more social services. Paul was proud of the unique way he led a strike of his union for better working conditions. When asked by clients seeking services during the strike about not crossing the picket line, he creatively changed the way the picket line worked, encouraging people to seek services they needed. In recent years, every winter, Paul looked forward to dressing up as Santa Claus to participate in direct actions for living wages and basic needs. Paul advocated for a caring economy that would prioritize our taxes for public services, including health care, utilities, food, and housing. He fought against being a casualty to oppressive norms or reactionary rules. He didn't pull back from his support for racial justice when he was called a communist for subscribing to the NAACP newspaper, The Crisis. And when in the Army in the 1960s, he faced harassment. Eventually, he gained his honorable discharge, and he was always honorable in the face of hate and closed-minded people. Paul never gave up, no matter how many times he was hurt by the cruel ignorance of others. When I'm asked about what he would have wanted to do as a career, when I asked Paul about what he wanted to do, he